really we should be having in an ongoing way. Like, hey, what feels good to you today? What do you want from sex today? Versus like just assuming that that thing that we have been doing for 5 years, like, let's keep doing that.
You just heard certified sex therapist Paula Leech. Paula received her bachelor's degree in family and human development at Arizona State University and then went to receive her master's degree in family therapy at the University of Massachusetts. Post-family therapy licensure, she became AASECT, which stands for American Association for Sexuality Educators, Counselors, and Therapists. Paula then co-founded a sex therapy agency and training institute where she saw clients in addition to training therapists to become competent sex therapists themselves. Paula continues to regularly present at various training institutes, as well as universities and therapy agencies across the U.S. In today's show, Dave and I discussed misconceptions about sex therapy. Paula went on to discuss that it is important to seek professional help and that it is okay and not to be scared to address this topic. Later in the show, she gave us some book recommendations, and she also gave us some sound advice that she would have given to her 18-year-old self. Stay tuned to the show.
Welcome back to the Our 2 Cents podcast, the show where your local professionals sit down with an array of guests to hear their story and impart some wisdom for both business and life-improving skills. This is your place to hear business and community leaders discuss relevant topics that matter to you.
And welcome to the show today. My name is Kyle Jones, and I'm joined in studio with my co-host Dave Plivlich, and we are joined on Zoom after some technical troubleshooting with Paula Leech. Before we get into today's episode, I want to encourage our listeners to find us on Instagram, to visit our webpage, and to engage with us on there so that we can better provide guests for our community. Paula, happy to have you here today, and sorry for all the technical troubles.
No worries. Thanks for having me.
So before we get started, can you kind of give us some misconceptions that you hear with respect to your field of expertise?
Yes, I'm a sex therapist and I train sex therapists. And one of the first things that I like to let folks know who come to see me, which now it's different, obviously, through Zoom, is that, but previously when we were in person, that there will be no touching. I do not touch anybody. Nobody's taking their clothes off. This is a talk therapy. And then I prescribe things for folks to try at home, exercises for folks to engage in with one another, touch type things for them to do to address whatever sexual concern they may have. So that's the major one, is that like, oh, are you going to be asked? I'm like, nope, keep your clothes on, keep your hands to yourself. Nobody's touching anyone. No one's taking off any clothes.
Well, that eliminates 7 of my questions right now.
So we can't have a podcast without injecting COVID into it. So has the Zoom meetings kind of changed your way of practice, or is it just, you just adapt with it and roll?
It has changed a lot of things, I think, for therapy in general. There's like an inherent vulnerability that comes with going to therapy, and still is present. Like it still is something that's there through Zoom, but not in as palpable a way. And so it affects like the felt experience of therapy. And also like it's harder for us as therapists to pick up on like the subtleties of people's body language. So it's really important for me as I'm talking with people about a subject that a lot of people don't talk about. It's important for me to be able to gauge their comfort level with it. And I do that from like subtle kinds of information, like shifting of body language, or kind of like fidgeting, or suddenly they're crossing their legs, and kind of that's the kind of stuff I pick up on. And it's harder to pick up on that through Zoom. The emotional experience is different. The things that we're able to tap into are different. We've all had to adapt. We make do.
So that's a great point there. So how have you adapted, and what are the pros now of doing like a Zoom meeting?
The pros are that it is much more accessible to people. You don't have to like, if you're going to make a therapy appointment, like, it's going to take us 20 minutes to get to the office. Then we're going to have to park. And then we have, and now it's like people can, on their break from work, they can pop in to do a therapy session. It's just easier. And we've just gotten used to working with the kind of information that we have. And so like, if a couple calls me, like I have couples call me from their car sometimes because their kids are in the house and this is a really private subject. And so I'll have to say like, back your phone up. I need to see more of your body, more of your person so that we can talk about this. So that may mean me giving some direction as to sort of how they orient themselves and stuff like that. But the pros are, is again, it's much more accessible, easier for people to pop onto therapy and take care of themselves.
We all did a lot of Zoom meetings during the pandemic. And for me, the worst part was when I was meeting with clients for the first time and they would have their camera off. So it's in essence, basically a phone call. And to me, I mean, obviously I'm not a therapist, but picking up on cues is very important. You know, like I'll give you an example of doing an estate plan with a couple, and we're talking about some sensitive estate planning issues, and one of the spouses may have a different opinion, but are kind of like maybe shy to raise it, or don't want to bring it up. And so normally if I'm sitting with them in person, I can pick up on those cues, like he or she, they want to say something here. And so that's my job to come in and say, okay, so, what do you think about this? Or let's talk a little more about this, this topic of discussion. Whereas on the phone, you don't get to see that, or Zoom without a camera.
With my one company, we do a lot of online meetings, and that's kind of my pet peeve. I do want that visual. I do want to read body language, like, because you can tell, do you get what I'm saying or not? Right. So do most of your people open to the video, or do you find a certain percentage of them that, it's just a phone call, they don't want to be on camera, or they make the excuse, I don't have a camera?
So most people, I think it's just assumed that we're going to be doing camera on video sessions. So far, I haven't had anyone say, hey, I'm not comfortable with that at all. I'm just going to do telephone. And not to say that there wouldn't be circumstances under which I would work with that, but especially if I'm working with a couple, I need to see both people. I need to see how they're reacting to one another. I need to see how far apart from one another they're sitting. I need to see any if they're shooting any glances at one another, if they talk about something, I need all of that information. And so if it's a couple or any kind of relationship, I need the camera on. That's a must.
Where are you located?
I'm in Portland, Oregon. Okay,
because I thought you were on the West Coast, but Davis said something about back east, and that's why I got a little confused. But
I just moved from Boston in August.
He told you.
Dave did his homework. All right. So in Portland, is the city such to where you can't have in-person therapy sessions right now, or is that your personal choice, or what?
So I am not licensed in Oregon.
Okay.
I'm only licensed in Massachusetts.
Okay.
So right now, any clients I see are Mass people. There's no option for me to do in person, but some therapists are starting to move back into in-person meetings, and some therapists are doing a hybrid type of a thing. It's happening. But I'm just in a place right now, and where I'm at professionally and in my life, where I don't intend to leave my home office anytime soon.
Okay.
Yeah, well, I went 100% virtual with my company just back in October and love it. Absolutely love it. So I got some questions. You mind if I jump in and ask some
Knock
questions?
it out.
So, all right. So obviously people can go to your website, paulaleech.com, and read about your background and stuff. And I'll just touch on this. I got a couple questions there, and then we can get into really, I want to know more about your process of what you deal with people. So what got you to switch? So, you got your bachelor's in family and human development at Arizona State University, then your master's degree. What made you transition to sex therapy?
I think my family was very open about sex and very kind of sex positive. We had conversations in my household about it. Nobody shied away from it. And despite that, I felt really uncomfortable with who I was sexually, just kind of awkward in my own skin, very self-conscious. I always felt aliens were looking down on the earth, watching us dance and fornicate and being what are they doing? That is bizarre, and I feel like that. So I just always felt really awkward around it. And I think because of that, I was interested in it. It's a lot of things for folks. It's I don't understand it, so I'm fascinated by it. And so I think that combined with I've always been interested in relationships. My parents divorced when I was younger, then got remarried to each other later on. And so I got to watch the whole sort of what happened there when they separated and how the pieces came back together and how they negotiated that and what the relationship looked like after. And so those two things combined, I think, led to a love for this and an interest in it. And so I became a marriage and family therapist knowing that this was where I was headed, because you have to get your master's degree in some kind of therapy area, like social work or mental health, and then you get certified after you've gotten your master's degree and after you've gotten licensed as a mental health professional.
Like a subspecialist. That story kind of reminds me of our buddy, Michael Friedman. I don't know if you know, he was always deathly afraid of flying and then went and got his pilot's license.
No. I'm aware of that story. Well aware of that story. And once he got that license, okay, I'm done. I did it. Chalk that off. I'm not doing that again, but he did.
But to take that step though. So maybe this is for our listeners as well as my education, but what is sex therapy? I mean, in essence of it, what is it?
Oh my gosh, yes. And that's a fantastic question. It is so much more than how people think about it. So I work with couples who are going through infidelity. I work with people who are interested in non-monogamy. I work with people who are practicing non-monogamy. I work with kinky folks, and I work with couples that come in where one partner is struggling with the other partner's kinks. I work with, people in the LGBTQ community who are, maybe struggling with concerns around gender identity or sexual orientation. I work with sexual dysfunctions, and this is kind of like my wheelhouse: erectile dysfunction, premature ejaculation, delayed ejaculation, sexual pain, vaginismus, a low desire, no desire, those kinds of things. And then sexual trauma and stuff like that. So there's just like a ton. And I work with a lot of parents who call me and are like, this is what's going on with my kid. Is this normal? Is this okay? Has something happened to them sexually? So it encompasses a lot. And people are always surprised at what it actually is compared to what people's impressions are, is that you go to a sex therapist and I'm going to prescribe you a bunch of different positions or techniques. And it's not like that at all.
This is not a Karma Sutra practice. It's
exactly. Yeah.
I mean, it comes down to mental health really, because what you're talking about, it has to do with mental health issues. Some are physical. You're talking about dysfunctions, but for the most part, it's a mental health issue.
It is absolutely completely interwoven into all the other parts of who we are as people. And it is absolutely influenced by all the other parts of that, that we are as people, and how we are living our lives and doing our day-to-day, our past experiences, our attachment to our family of origin, what we learned about love and closeness and intimacy through that. It's really complex stuff.
Well, I'm sure that's part of it too, that, I know with a lot of people, love is equated to sex, and that's just not it. You know what I mean? Sex is sex is sex. It doesn't mean love. So, there's a big difference, right? So expand on that.
Well, and yet that's the thing that's so powerful about it, is sex is for a lot of folks who are socialized male, it is one of the primary, if not the primary way of expressing and receiving love. And it is one of the primary, if not the primary place where they can really be vulnerable and let go. So it's incredibly meaningful and powerful in that way. It's like people are like, oh, it's just, sex, whatever. It's like, oh, no. To some people, this is everything. And to all of us, it's a means of expressing, again, our ability to love and connect to ourselves and love and connect to other people. It's one avenue and one of the main avenues.
Do you find yourself working with people in a relationship that are been married for 6 months, and on the other end of the spectrum, people have been married 40 years? Do you take different approaches with those clients?
Yeah, the whole gamut. People who are dating, people have been together for a lifetime, and I would say that the approach is, I'm always looking for similar kinds of things, and also just depending on the issue that they bring in, right? It's also specific, but the kinds of things that show up that can be problematic earlier on can be similar to the kinds of things that we struggle with and that we have been struggling with in an ongoing way 30 years in. It takes different forms. So yeah, the kinds of issues can be different, and they also can be very similar. It's a very not a very clear response, but it really depends. What I get a lot is especially with newer relationships, what I get a lot is we had a lot of sex in the beginning, then we moved in together, or then we got engaged, or then we got married, or then we had kids, and things take a drastic turn. What I get a lot with folks who have been together for a really long time is maybe our sexual functioning, our abilities have changed. As we age, our sexuality ages along with us, and it changes along with us. And so the kinds of things that we were really into before, we're just, are not the same. They don't feel the same, or we're not, or maybe even aren't even really capable of doing. And so how do we have a sexual life now in the midst of these changes? It's always an interesting conversation, because we fall into such a rigid script around sex, oh, this is how we do it. And then we just do it like that for forever. But really our bodies we're changing. all the time. It's not just a problem that like folks who are older, who have been together for a long time deal with. Pregnancy can cause a lot of changes for folks in their sexual life and in how they experience each other sexually. So this is like a conversation that really we should be having in an ongoing way. Like, hey, what feels good to you today? What do you want from sex today? Versus like just assuming that that thing that we have been doing for 5 years, like, let's keep doing that.
I hate using like terms like normal, but what an example of something that's normal that you treat? So we can kind of like, obviously I'm not looking for patients' names, but what do you see that's very common that most people can relate to? So then we can kind of break that down and see what your process is.
You never know what's going behind closed doors, what you think is normal out there.
Well, that's why I hate to use the word normal, but for what most people can relate to, I mean, obviously there's taboos or whatever you can go off on and number, but something that would be relatively common that you see. What would be an example of that?
So the most common thing that I see is erectile dysfunction.
So that would obviously be from a male's perspective.
Yeah.
Okay.
That's the most common thing that I see for me by far. And the interesting thing about that is that a lot of sex therapists, it's so like, depending on where you're located, right? Like, because a lot of therapists that I work with have had no experience with it. And for me, it was by far has been the most common thing that I deal with. And okay. I really enjoy working with it because it is very receptive to therapy. It's a really treatable issue.
So treatable without medication.
Without medication,
wow.
Yeah.
What percentage or portion, I mean, to best of your estimates, is that a actual physical impairment versus a psychological impairment?
There's always a psychological component, even when there's a physical, when there's a medical thing that we're dealing with.
So even when there's a physical issue, there's a psychological component that exacerbates it?
Yes.
Probably would be a way to say it.
And so even if someone comes in with like a circulatory issue or,
right.
Diabetes or something going on that may have an impact on it, I'm always, the conversation is always, well, let's see what's possible when we are able to diminish or minimize the influence of anxiety on this issue. Because anxiety is like the major culprit behind all of the sexual dysfunction.
Yeah. And you treat the anxiety as opposed with medication, I'm assuming with therapy. And that's where you come in, correct?
Yep. We treat it behaviorally primarily. Because here's the thing, like a lot of folks will come in and be like, can I just go and take Viagra, Cialis? Yeah, you can. But the thing with those medications is that the conditions still have to be right. I don't know how explicit I'm allowed to get on this show.
I'm sure someone will turn off if they want.
The conditions still have to be right for you to gain an erection. And that means you still have to be in a place of like calm release in your body. If you are watching yourself, waiting for it to happen, anxiously waiting for it to happen, it's not going to happen, even with the Viagra. So Viagra helps you keep. It doesn't help you gain. It helps you keep an erection, right? And so, the risk of me being like, yeah, totally cool, and I'm on board with whatever my clients feel like would be helpful for them. But the risk is that they go take the Viagra, they aren't able to gain, and then they really think that there's something wrong with them because not even Viagra is able to help me. This is not about anything being broken. This is about literally your sort of head getting in the way of your body doing what it's designed to do.
Yeah, and with Viagra, Cialis, I mean, it's still a medication. It's a drug, right? So there's trade-off to everything. There's risk to everything. So if you take those, there's risk, right? Other than maybe like a vitamin C in small doses, I can't think of anything that is prescribed that doesn't come without risk. That's why you have those warnings on the labels. That's why you have those, risks may include, and, a laundry list of things that go down with any prescribed medication.
A few years ago for me, like I was just dealing with a lot of stress, and I was going to my doctor, and he goes, I'm like, well, I saw this commercial, can we try this? And he goes, look, I'll prescribe you anything you want, but you got to get at the root of what's going on. You've got to get to the heart of it,
right?
Because the medication really at the end of the day,
it's a Band-Aid, right?
It is a Band-Aid.
What does that look like? What processes do you go through to lessen anxiety or to, as you said, get your head out of the way of what your body was designed to do?
Well, so a couple of things. One thing is, for clients that come in who are dealing with this particular struggle, it's really important that they understand the ways that they think they're helping themselves that are actually making it worse. For example, about to get real here.
Right. Go ahead. We're good. We're
So,
grown-ups here.
So, in the course of a sexual experience, if someone, starts to worry that they're losing their erection, or they start to lose their erection. What typically happens is that, oh my gosh, I'm getting panicked. I'm worried about it. I move into this like power through mentality where I have to work harder. Like now I'm working harder at sex and I'm working harder to try to keep my erection, which working at sex in that way, worrying about being able to maintain, introduces stress hormone into the system. So what's happening now? We've moved into like a fight or flight response. Blood is actively moving away from where we want it to go. So it's moving to, either our vital organs or our large muscle groups. So sensitivity is getting, is taking a hit. What folks do, what men do, people with penises do, is they start to like clench their pelvic floor muscles, group of muscles that stretch from like, the backside through the front, holds up your bladder and bowels, right? Mm-hmm. So they clench their pelvic floor muscles, because what happens is that any like remaining blood flow in the area gets pushed into the shaft of the penis. And so it feels like they feel like they're helping themselves, and then it gets cut off at the base. And so then you will lose your erection. So again, like for a moment, you feel like you're helping yourself, but you're actually sabotaging yourself. And so it's really important. The clients that I work with understand exactly what's happening in their body, exactly what they are doing that is exacerbating the issue. And the importance of understanding that as soon as they start to like work at sex, as soon as they start to try and perform at sex, that they are actively kind of working against the process. But, and the interesting thing about it, and another thing that is important to understand, is like your whole arousal, everyone's arousal process, governed by our like sleep, rest, digest response, which is why people get morning erections and nocturnal erections. It does not live in our like expansion of energy stress response. So when one's on, the other's off. Like it's that simple. As soon as we move into a stress response, our body starts doing things that, it's like, oh, this is not safe. This is not the time to stay and play. It's fight or flight. So it's important to lay all that out so that people really understand what is happening here and how significant the psychological impact is on the body.
So that's kind of your average deal. So what's the typical amount of time, or how many sessions do they go through on average to get through this?
Yeah, good question.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
So then what therapy looks like, this is so hard to condense, right? But like if the person is in a relationship, it's very important for me to have the partner come in with them, which can be a really hard thing for folks to do, because this is like a really vulnerable conversation. It's really personal stuff, but sex is vulnerability and sex is personal. And if we can't talk about it with our partner, that's a thing, right? Like, and that contributes to the stress that we're walking into the bedroom with. I have to do this right, or my partner is going to be disappointed, or I'm going to be embarrassed in front of my partner. Like, wow, isn't sex supposed to be the place where we can just show up and be whoever we need to be and have whatever kind of experience we want to have, and know that we're okay? Like, no matter what, we're going to be there for each other, and we can bounce back and we can pivot and everything's cool. So that's always interesting. But I need the partner there anyways, because I need to clear up any funky ideas that the partner may have about why this is going on. Because people always have really funky ideas about like, oh, well, it must mean they're not attracted to me, or they must be cheating on me, or that contribute to the pressure that exists between the two of them. Because it's vitally important that I'm finding whatever pressure points exist in the couple and that we are eliminating them right off the bat.
So let's talk about the opposite sex. So, you hear the wives all kind of sit around sometimes like, oh my God, all he wants is sex. The male is again, maybe a lot of times the male does equate that to love. And that's when they need that vulnerability and that openness. But then the wives are going, I just did this all day. Now you want to have sex? Really? And so yeah, what about that opposite side? Because, it's like they completely lose interest in sex at some point, and it's like, well, okay, well, what am I supposed to do?
Well, the interesting thing is that if it was a couple, say we're talking about, like a straight couple, heterosexual couple, and the wife was not interested in sex, like could take it or leave it, and he's struggling with erectile dysfunction, they probably wouldn't be coming to my office. Sure. You know what I mean? Like they probably wouldn't be coming to see me.
Correct.
Because
they would be in the same space. So I guess it would be nothing.
Yeah, exactly. Because misconception that's out there is that folks who are socialized male men are supposed to be desirous all the time. If you have any kind of like sexual challenge and sex suddenly becomes about feeling really emasculated, embarrassed, and ashamed, why would you desire it? So most of my clients who struggle with erectile dysfunction do not have a ton of desire. I'm not going to seek out an experience that's embarrassing for me. That makes me feel like I'm going to lose my relationship every time it happens. I'm not going to seek that out. And so that's another interesting part of therapy is like we get to the place where suddenly, erectile dysfunction is not a problem, but like it takes a while for desire to climb back on board. We need some wins and consistent wins. And when I say wins, I don't just mean like, successful sexual experiences where the ED was not a problem. I'm talking about successful sexual experiences where either we didn't have difficulties with erections, but also like if we did, it was cool between both partners. It wasn't this big show-stopping moment where all of a sudden we're like, what happened? Oh my God, this is so bad. They were able to pivot and do something else where the guy really comes to understand that like I can truly show up here and whatever happens is okay and we can handle it and still have a really great time and it's and have a pleasurable experience together. Right. And then desire starts to come back on board, but low desire is like part of the package most of the time.
You keep saying socialized male and I'm getting confused. Or what do you mean by that?
So we have men who identify as men. I work with a lot of non-binary people. I work with trans people. And so for me, not
your
all
lingo's,
of my clients,
okay. Your lingo's
right?
different. Okay. I get it.
Yep.
Okay.
Yep. And it's really people who are socialized male, people who are socialized female have very different packages when it comes to, like how they learned about sex and what they, how they think of themselves sexually and so on.
Yeah. I get it. As we're talking, I'm thinking like, am I missing something? I was
Yeah. No, I appreciate you clarifying.
So,
yeah.
okay.
I work with cisgender people, transgender people. I work with non-binary people who I work with heterosexual, gay, so the language is evolving around this stuff.
And that's why it's really confusing because for someone who is not in that community, right, who doesn't have any exposure to it, you can see why it's confusing because we're like, we're not talking about the same thing, but are we? And that's
totally
to clarify.
Totally.
And so, that's a kind of a fascinating question in and of itself. How do you make sure that everyone's understanding that what you're talking about?
Sure.
Is it based on just the individual patient, I'm assuming?
It is.
Okay. And that's probably pretty easy. But what about when you're having general conversations like a podcast like this, or when you're giving a talk to a group of 1,000 people in a conference hall, right? Where everyone's different and unique in their own ways. So how do you navigate those waters?
Yeah, well, I appreciate that because I'm so like immersed in this that it's nice to be reminded that like I need to be specific around this stuff because even some of the podcasts that I have done before are like therapy podcasts where I'm talking to other therapists and a therapy kind of audience, So yeah, in therapy, it's very clear. You know who
your audience is at that point.
I know exactly who my audience is. And even when it's not, that it's a very usual, typical part of the conversation to say, hey, what are your pronouns? And, he, him, she, her, they, them. And then we get kind of clear about where we're at. And in therapy is so personal so quickly that you get so much information that you're able to orient pretty quickly.
Yeah, that question was with the patient. It's pretty clear, right? I mean, you know know what you're expecting. But I guess the better question would have been when you're talking to a general audience. That's probably where it gets a little dicey.
That's where it gets a little dicey. And so again, I appreciate the clarifying question, because to me, folks who are socialized male, because not all people that I work with who have penises consider themselves men. Right. And so I try to be very careful around that.
So Dave, I think you train other therapists in this. I mean, so one of some of the challenges that you run into with them, because I assume you train therapists all across the United States, right?
Yep.
So what are some of the biggest challenges you run into with training some of that?
Training somebody in sex therapy and doing this work?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. So there's a couple things, like anyone who is interested in becoming a sex therapist, who is looking to get certified through the major governing body in the United States, has to go through a weekend. It's called a sexual attitude reassessment, where you spend the weekend being exposed to different kinds of explicit media, different kinds of activities that are designed to reveal your biases and areas of discomfort personally around sex, because all of us have them. None of us got sufficient sex education in any capacity. And so nobody makes it to adulthood without some bruising in this area. And it's really important to know what we bring into the room with our clients, like sex addiction. Sex addiction is a really, really popular term right now. I can't tell you how many clients I get who describe what they're going through as sex addiction when it is not an addiction at all, right? Like actual compulsive, out of control sexual behavior is fairly rare, where you literally can't stop yourself. You're getting in trouble at work. That's fairly rare. But this gets diagnosed all the time. Doug Ron Harvey talked about this. Doug Ron Harvey talks about how we jump to like this diagnosis premature diagnosis, no pun intended, because out of our own discomfort in digging into this material further with our clients. A lot of therapists are not trained in sexuality in any capacity. This is a completely separate category. So a lot of folks that come into their therapist and say, oh, I think this is my issue, we get uncomfortable because nothing brings your own sexuality into the room like talking about sex. Like it instantly is in the room with you, with your client, your own stuff. And so we jump there sometimes in order to avoid digging deeper into an uncomfortable conversation that may make us feel uncomfortable. It's looking at, a lot of therapists do not anticipate how much you are challenged to look at yourself and to deal with yourself and your own kind of like healing and as part of this process. So that's part one. And then the approach that I utilize is called sensate focus with like erectile dysfunction. And it is like a progressive behavioral, it's designed to sort of like show the body through experiences that it's pairing the relaxation response with touch and increasingly sexual stimulation so that we're no longer moving into fight or flight. So we're bypassing that process. And that can be hard to get our clients to buy into, because most of the time, by the time they're on our couch, there's like an urgency to get this done and out of their lives. And this process requires that they slow down quite a bit, because trying to get to the next step or trying to, just skip to, oh, well, what's going to work is part of the problem, right? Like that I'm in this performance goal-oriented mindset around sex, and that absolutely backfires. And so we have to learn a completely different way of approaching it. And so that can be a hard thing to train therapists how to do, is to talk about this in a way that their clients are really, really buy into and are like, oh, I get it. What are we doing tonight? What does this look like for us this evening?
So I don't know if you answered the question earlier, but let's take the erectile dysfunction. Somebody comes to you. I mean, it's like, am I going to be cured in like 3 weeks? I mean, or is this going to take 6 months, or is this going to take 2 years? I mean, so what can they expect on average? I mean, every individual is going to be different, clearly, but on average, how long does that take?
Okay. So, and this is a very common question. What I tell my clients is that it would be misleading and like crappy and unethical of me to give you any kind of an answer, because we don't know what we're going to bump into. If I have a couple where every time he loses his erection, she shames him for it, and she will not stop doing that, then therapy is a challenge, and it's going to take, can we even work with that? If he continues to feel like every time he goes to engage with his partner, he's going to be, if he doesn't do it perfectly, he's going to be shamed for it. Can we even work with that? So getting the partner on board, however long that takes, that could take a while. Our ability to move out of the performance mindset, that's challenging. We were trained that sex is performance, right? And so getting out of that goal-oriented strive to get this right, to do this right mindset can be super simple for some folks, and for others really, really challenging. So what I tell everybody is that if you show up here, if you are engaged in this process, if you ask questions of me, if I prescribe something that you're like, what in the heck, why was she, don't phone it in to tell me. That doesn't make any sense to me. Like, I need to have that feedback. And the more engaged you are in the process and the more you really sort of like surrender to it. So with sex therapy, the slower you go, the faster you go. And that's really true. And so, really, the more you're able to engage, the more efficiently we're able to move through it. It just varies for everybody. I've never had people stay with me for years. It's always like typically within a year or so, like at the most, because like I said, I've had some people come in and in 2 sessions we're done, but then others where it's just, like I said, this stuff is insidious and it really gets so deeply ingrained, it can take a little bit more effort. There's always movement. That's the plus side. It's like, if we will absolutely see things shifting. And the great thing about the behavioral aspect of it is they get to actually notice it, versus some aspects of therapy which can feel really abstract.
I appreciate her answer, because if I heard your question, and obviously that's one that probably everyone who's listening would be curious about. But if she answered it in any way different than she did, I was going to say, okay, I don't really trust her.
No,
Yeah, that's it.
Because, I always, clients will come in. I'm a practicing attorney here in Bakersfield. And so I'll have clients come in and they'll say, oh, I heard that, my case is worth this and it should be done in this period of time. And I always say, well, look, if any attorney has guaranteed you any outcome, run as fast as you can away from that attorney. Yeah. So to say, can see it even more in your circumstances. If you give an idea of time of how long it's going to take, and yet someone comes in and they take longer, well, that you've almost like kind of shot yourself in the foot, because now they're like, oh, well, now what else is wrong with me? Because she said it'll only take 5 months and it's taken 9 months. And
and this is the thing too, is like, we're working with anxiety. So if I said,
you add to their anxiety.
Hey, you've got 8 sessions. Each session they're counting going, okay, I've got 3 more. Am I cured yet? Is this gone yet? Which is exactly what what we don't want to be doing, right? We want to eliminate the anxiety. And so, ineffectual all around.
I don't know how much time we got left, but I got some more questions. How are you doing on time? You got kids that you got to babysitter's going to hold up, right?
I can 15 minutes or so.
With COVID, obviously, and you hear this a lot, people were stuck at home together for a long time, and they weren't used to that. I mean, have you had to deal a lot with that over the past year or so? I mean.
Oh, absolutely. And I think that like a funky idea that was out there for a little bit, especially towards the beginning of COVID, was like, oh, everyone's stuck at home. Everyone should be having all this sex.
I heard about the new baby boom, right?
Yeah. What we know about like desire and how it is maintained and created is like desire is built off of the distance in between self and others. So it's that like mystery in relationships that's so important to have, like, and so when you're crammed inside with each other all day, every day, and you're like, I just heard you farting in the living room. Like, it's not sexy, you're kind of a jerk to your coworkers that, or like, oh, well, now I know it. Like, this is one of the major like principles of couples therapy and sex therapy in general, is like differentiation, feeling like you are a distinctly separate person from your partner. And if we think on like some of the times I've been most attracted to my partners, it's like the cliche is like, I go back to my first boyfriend in college where I went to his like concerts. He was in a band, and like seeing him on stage, and like that's a moment of pride, which is born from differentiation. Like, oh, you have a set of skills and things that I don't possess. We are very different. And that is really sexy. That is really interesting. And so the ideal is that like, we are each day going off, doing our thing, coming together and being curious about one another, because we're constantly changing. It's when we fall into the like, I know exactly how you're going to finish that sentence. I know we're 2 peas in a pod. That is like the total desire smasher. And COVID absolutely has done that for a lot of people, where suddenly our sex life is plummeted and we don't know why. Well, it's because there's been too much closeness, too much togetherness, not enough feeling separate lives, autonomous from one another.
That's interesting. Obviously, COVID forced that on a lot of people with being stuck at home, especially during the beginning. I mean, it was like months and months on end. Do you work with couples, but let's say actually work together? And is that a problem you face with where husband and wife are actually working in the same office, or they run a business together and they're literally spending 24/7 together? Is that a recipe for disaster?
It can be. I mean, there are ways that couples can navigate that. I'm always like hopeful when I hear about that they each have like very distinct hobbies and things that they like to do that are very different. Like, where do the differences live? Because the differences are always there. Even the couples that I work with that come in that like, oh, we're both very type A, we work in a very similar industry, or we work together, it's like, okay, but there are differences here. And it's really important that we zero in on them, because otherwise this feels like your partner's an extension of you. It already, like, partnership already starts to feel at a certain point that like lusty energy moves out, and it starts to feel like a familial kind of a bond anyways. And so when we're so hyper focused on like, oh, all the things that we are similar, it kind of kicks that up even further. So part of the job of therapy is like, okay, you work together. What do you do separately outside of work? What are your hobbies? What are the things that you enjoy? What are the differences that exist between the two of you? How do those differences actually sort of like complement one another? Where, how do they work against you at times? So we really start to pull that apart, so that again, there can be that space, and there's a really fantastic sex therapist. Her name's Esther Perel. And I always recommend people look at her TED Talks and stuff. And she talks about how domestic life, like we often, in our quest for a sense of security and safety, we completely eliminate the mystery that is inherent in couple. You're never going to really know your partner. And it can be really beneficial to have that idea front of mind. You're never going to really know them, and nobody needs to be with another person anymore. We choose to be with our partners every single day, and that keeps us working for our relationships, nurturing them, putting our best foot forward. And that keeps space that is so needed for desire to sort of thrive, or at least have any kind of a life at all.
You mentioned the word, it becomes familial, right? At some point, if or potentially, I should say, if couples are working together or spend that much time and don't have separate hobbies. Now, adding kids to the equation in a marriage, for example, now, is that starting some similar processes where now things tend to become more familial, and that's exactly what you've just created as a family?
Oh, absolutely. Oh my gosh. Yeah. I mean, as I mentioned earlier, Dr. Water was my mentor, taught this class that I took at the very beginning stages of my sex therapy training. And he talked about these relationship deepening events, moving in together, getting engaged, getting married. And these really represent points of like further merging as a couple. And with further merging and with the kind of attachment or the kind of bond taking on a different feeling of more familial kind of quality, that differentiation stuff that we were talking about starts to fall off a little bit. And then B, family of origin stuff that we're carrying around can start to show itself, which is why long-term partnership or marriage is so hard, because we are confronted with our attachment wounding, the lessons that we learned about love. My dad left or my mom left when I was 3. So what did you learn? Well, I learned that love leaves, or, that love is unpredictable, or, and these themes play out in our adult relationships and in our sexual life, which is why all of a sudden, oh my gosh, I have no desire for sex at all. And actually I get really anxious and averse around it, which is why, suddenly I am struggling with premature ejaculation after we just had kids. And I just, watched you become a mother, and I have a different kind of seeing you through new eyes. And, these things are so significant. We have to look at all of it.
And that's not something that people routinely, or at least I didn't in my marriage or beginning of my marriage. We didn't talk about what is it going to look like when we do have a family, and how are things going to change? And then, fast forward 18 years when they're all grown up and out of the house, then what are we going to do? That's life.
People run into that.
And you hope that you progress to that, right? Because that means you're doing something right and you're still 6 feet above ground, which is a good thing. But people don't really talk about that. So how do you, I guess that's why you have a job probably, is because all these life events come into play and it needs sorting out. And I guess that's where you shine.
Yeah, well, absolutely. I mean, and I think that another thing that keeps me in business is that we, again, this idea of feeling like we know our partner. I can't tell you how many people come in and are like, oh, I just, I caught my partner watching porn. Suddenly I don't know you. Well, there's parts of our partners that we do not have access to, and some parts of our partner that we will never have access to. Infidelity, when people catch their partner watching porn or, doing, oh, you're interested in that sexually and I never knew it. Like, who are you? And it puts us in touch with the inherent mystery that lives in our partners. And that's scary. That's scary for everybody. We like to feel like, oh, I know you. It makes me feel secure.
Right. Who needs your services? How does one know what they're doing in their life or their relationship is healthy? Are you of the opinion that, when you reach a certain age, you go get a physical, you go to 40, you get a physical every year, working on your physical health, or, you turn 45, hey, it's colonoscopy time. I mean, how do you view what you do as far as what couples or people should consider in maintenance of that aspect of their life?
Great question. And yeah, I think that to me, what could be more important than taking care of your relationships or yourself in this way? People that come to therapy, are choosing to look at themselves and to confront the things that they're dealing with and to hold themselves accountable and hold their partners accountable. And I just think that there's nothing braver than that, really, because in the moment, it's very easy to avoid. And we all have our stuff, and relationships all have their issues. And it's very easy in the moment to avoid these things, but they live and they take on a life. And what I tell my couples is I just want you to have a sexual life and a life in general, where you're sitting across from one another in the morning, having your cup of coffee, and your mind's empty. There's no ghosts sitting there with you. There's no other occupants in the kitchen. Oh, this thing that happened last month, that's still pissing me off. And that one thing that you did 5 years ago that I haven't let go of. Clear all of this stuff out so that we can really connect. And again, what could be more important for you? Because our relationships are like the air that we breathe, but also if you have kids, what could be more important for your family? And just, yeah, in terms of our sexual lives, I think we have a lot of really awful, funky ideas out there about sex that are really harmful. Like, oh, if you're not having sex regularly, there must be something wrong with your relationship. Frequency of sex is a barometer for the overall health of your relationship, and stuff like that. I think people really, it causes a lot of pain. And then we all just have our own healing to do around our sexuality. So yeah, I could go on and on. I think it is like, just to, like, everybody should be in therapy, but as you know, there are like lots of specific things that bring people in that are important too.
Well, you said you are not licensed in Oregon. Are you planning on getting licensed in Oregon, or what's your
I am,
goal
yeah,
there?
I'm planning on getting licensed in Oregon. It's I have 2 toddlers at the moment. And so between teaching and like mentoring therapists and then like couple of couples that I work with, yeah, I'm not like I'm not opening my doors up yet. I just can't accommodate it. So I'm taking my time with it. And then hopefully, by the time the kids are in elementary school, I can like fully restart things, right?
So that being said, and unless our listeners are in Massachusetts, what do you recommend for people that are seeking somebody like you? And I assume it has to be within their state, correct? So our listeners have to find somebody in California. Where do they go? How do they go about doing that? Google?
Yeah. So they can go on to, it's called AASECT. So it's AASECT.org. And it's the American Association for Sexuality Educators, Counselors, and Therapists. And there's a Find a Therapist feature on that website where you can type in your zip code or whatever, and you can find a therapist that way. Some therapists can do like consultations. You just can't do therapy if the therapist is not located in your state. So yeah, AASECT is a really great way to find a sex therapist.
What advice do you have for people who are looking to seek that help out or that therapy out in determining which therapist is right for them?
Yeah, that's a really great question.
You said you work with a lot of people in the are transgenders or non-binary. So if someone is going through that or struggling with that, you probably wouldn't recommend going to someone who has no experience dealing with those issues, right? Self-evident there. But other than that, how do you, for example, do you recommend like a woman see a woman or a man see a man, or does that matter? Like all those things, like what, is there different comfort levels that people have? So therefore they may not get the most out of it. So what do you advise on that?
Yeah, that's a really great question. And for me, what I tell folks who come to see me for the first time is like, hey, I'm going to dive in and I'm going to treat this like I would a typical therapy session. And at the end of it, as I would in any first therapy session, I'm going to give you sort of the summary of what I'm seeing and how I'm conceptualizing our work together. Based off of that and based off of how this has felt for you, you get to decide, go home, talk together, think about it, and don't book an appointment with me right now. Let me know if you want to book an appointment with me again, because that fit is so hugely important. You don't want to have to wrestle with a bunch of like personality barriers or discomfort or like, oh, it's taking me a really long time to trust this therapist. You want to be able to really dive right into the work. So a lot of it is also just sort of like, how do I feel while I'm talking to this person over the phone? Almost every therapist will offer like a 15-minute phone call consultation kind of a deal. How do I feel? What questions do I need to ask? That sort of thing. And I honestly like the approach that I take to working with like erectile dysfunction and stuff like that. I have seen it be so tremendously effective that I also encourage folks that like, if you're struggling with some of the difficulties that come with being attached to a penis, like premature ejaculation, delayed ejaculation, that you check with the therapist to see if they use some kind of behavioral approach like sensate focus, because it can be so, again, because it is so hugely effective.
That's important advice, I think, to have up front, because I know people going through therapy, not necessarily sex therapy, but it's just therapy in general. And I feel like it's hard to make that step to go do it right. And then once you get there, it's like you're almost immediately invested because you want results. And so I don't know if a lot of people stop to consider like, well, maybe I need to try somebody else. And if I have to go through 2 or 3 to get there, that's fine. But I think that's really important. But I don't think you see that because like you want results quick. It's hard to do. So you get there and it's just like, all right, hey, this is, I have to stay with this one person. It's the same thing with doctors too. You know, medical doctors, you get referred or you see your doctor the first time, and you're just like, well, that's my doctor. It's like, well, yeah, it's your doctor, but you know, ask questions like, is it a good fit? Right. I mean, these are very important relationships you're establishing. Yeah. Same with your attorney, right? Not so much in, you know, smaller issues, but like family law practitioners, you know, I know here in town, and I refer a lot of clients and friends and family. If you're going through divorce and dealing with child custody issues, I mean, you better have a good relationship with your attorney, because this is going to define the next chapter of your life. So I think those are important questions to ask. And I don't know that people do it that often.
It can be so discouraging to, first off, seek out sex therapy, which again, for a lot of people, they think about it, they avoid it, they get anxious about it, they think about it, And so to seek out sex therapy, sit in front of someone, share your most intimate personal details of your life, and then feel like, I'm not digging this person. I don't click with them. Like, it can be really discouraging to then feel like you have to start all over again. And so I absolutely think it's a fantastic idea to treat it like that. Like, oh, like anything, like friends, like dating, I want to feel like I'm comfortable with this person. I want to feel like that chemistry of like, okay, cool. This is a person I feel like I could ask questions of, and I feel like is competent. And then also like is relatable still though. And, you know, like it really does need to feel like a good fit. This is an important journey for folks. And you want to feel like you have a really great co-passenger on your side.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. Well, I know you have kiddo obligations to attend to. We end every podcast with some rapid fire questions. Okay. So if you can indulge us here for maybe a few more minutes, I'd greatly appreciate it. Dave, I'll go first, and then we'll just go back and forth. Okay. You don't have the list? Oh, I guess. All right. We'll trade. All right. What is a quote you live by?
You know what? I suck at these kinds of rapid fire questions. I like patience is the wisdom of knowing things will unfold in their own time. I like that one.
I'm going to have you repeat that because it went over my head real quick, but I want to
fully hear what you said.
Okay.
There's two. Okay. One is the therapy thing. So the therapy thing is, am I getting enough of what I need to make grieving what I'm not getting worth my while? That's from Terry Real. That's the relationship reconciling, relationship reckoning moment that happens with a lot of couples. Am I getting enough of what I need to make grieving what I'm not getting worth my while? And then my one that has helped me a lot is patience is the wisdom of knowing that things will unfold in their own time.
I wanted that one, but all right, go ahead.
Too late. Okay. If you could turn back time and talk to your 18-year-old self, what would you tell her?
It is such a good question. It's such a tough one. 18 is such a challenging time. I would probably say, honestly, you don't need to have sex to get love.
That's like
for me, that's probably what I would say is like, you don't need to do that to get love.
With what we're bombarded with in media and stuff, I think a lot of young kids think that that's the case. Good to hear people say that it's not. So, yeah. All right, last one. And I'm going to focus it towards, since we're talking about sex therapy in your profession, if someone wants to read a book in your field of expertise, what do you recommend and why?
Oh, there's so many good ones. Okay. So Come As You Are by Emily Nagoski is a fantastic one. And there's actually like a new series on Netflix called The Principles of Pleasure that's really good for people with penises, for some men, people who identify as men who are interested in pleasing vulvas. She Comes First is a fantastic book by Ian Kerner. It's fantastic. So those are like, and then Esther Perel, anything by Esther Perel. So Mating in Captivity is a really good one that speaks to some of the stuff I was talking about earlier, how like domestic life squashes the like mystery and the separateness that we need for desire. And then State of Affairs is another really good one, talking about how we treat infidelity and how the way that we treat infidelity can be largely off base. We always treat it as a symptom of like a broken relationship, when sometimes it can be, and sometimes it can be something that keeps someone in a relationship. And sometimes it can be something that we do to escape from ourselves, from parts of ourselves, right? And to make contact with other parts of who we are that we don't bring into our primary relationship. So there's really interesting like complexity in that book too. That's pretty awesome.
All those are very thought-provoking.
Yeah.
Cool stuff.
What's the? And I wanted to bring it up earlier, but I forgot. What's the like the lady who I saw her on an article that popped up recently. I think she was like, I don't know if she was the first, but like in my mind, she's like the first sex therapist. She's really elderly now.
Dr. Ruth?
Dr. Ruth.
Dr. Ruth.
Dr. Ruth, I think she passed.
Yeah,
That's why I saw that. I think.
Yeah.
Okay, that's why I saw it. So obviously, I mean, she's been doing this for a long time. But have you ever read or studied anything that she's done or like her thought process in this, and how has it like changed with modern times? I was kind of curious as to what you thought of that.
I haven't. Sadly, I'm not as familiar with Dr. Ruth as a lot of people are, but the approach like that I keep referencing that I use to treat sexual dysfunctions comes from Masters and Johnson. It's old school in that way, but it has evolved. So I do utilize some of the quote Masters stuff, including Masters and Johnson. But yeah, I don't, I'm not as familiar with Dr. Ruth as I would like to be, as I should be.
Oh, I was just curious because everyone knows her name, right?
You're old.
Everyone knows her name.
Everyone knows her. Yeah,
Everybody does,
she's the OG.
Yeah, as soon as you start saying it, I'm like, yeah, I know, right?
Yeah. All right. Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Paula, for joining us. This has been an interesting one, little unique, different than what we normally do. But I
hope you enjoyed it.
Yeah,
I did. Thank you for having me. It was very fun to chat.
Yeah, and I'm sorry about all the technical glitches, and we definitely appreciate your patience.
We got through it.
Awesome. You take care.
Pleasure meeting you.
Yes.
Nice meeting you both.
Right. Bye now.
Take care.
This show has been brought to you by the Law Office of Kyle Jones, Troy Burton with the Lynn Company, CPA John Duffield, Scott Hansen Real Estate Lender, broker and investor, and Dave Plivlich, President and CEO of the Marcom Group and MarcomBranding.com. You've been listening to the Our 2 Cents podcast. Check out the show notes for links and more information about the show. Also visit our website at our2centspodcast.com or catch us on Instagram at Our 2 Cents Podcasts. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please subscribe and share with others.